following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Welcome to another edition of Claire's Corner along the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. My name is Claire Hall, your host for every one of these little expeditions into talk, banter about subjects of all sorts, and very glad today to welcome my frequent co-host, Gabriel Schechter. And how are you on this fine day? It is a beautiful Monday, November, at least here along the Oregon coast as we're recording.
It's beautiful here in Salem, too. In fact, I'm going to go for a walk this afternoon, which I don't feel like doing often in November, but today's the day for it.
You know, I might do that as well. Well, I think it is just interesting. You know, baseball, as I think you and I have discussed before, both on and off the air, provides such a really, besides being such a fascinating game in itself, it's really a prism as well, I think, to look at so many aspects of American life. And certainly I think the federal government, the presidency, have had, you know, largely, but not exclusively through the first pitch opening day ceremony, but a relationship between the federal executive and baseball that really no other sport can match. And let's get into the realm of myth and legend. And first off, my friend, I'd like you to help me set up a story involving the birth of our game and probably the most revered president in American history, Abraham Lincoln. But for folks maybe younger than us who don't know the name of Bill Stern, can you just give us a real quick capsule description of who he was, what he was all about?
I'd be happy to. Bill Stern, a legend in radio history, a Chicago broadcaster, reporter of sorts, and I think his heyday was from the maybe 20s or early 30s into the 1950s. He was a forerunner of Paul Harvey. He did radio broadcasts of fascinating, out-of-the-way stories that you wouldn't hear about otherwise. The big difference between Bill Stern and Paul Harvey was that they had an equally fine eye for a great story. Stern's just didn't have to be true. He was a great distance above making up a good story just for the sake of a good broadcast, and one of his most famous involved Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, and of course the alleged inventor of baseball, which I think even most fans know today. It is a folk myth, a poetic myth. You know, the story of the myth is a great story in itself, but for years, baseball tried to pass off the story that the game was essentially invented out of whole cloth by a West Point cadet in 1839 in Cooperstown, New York, by the name of Abner Doubleday. Not a shred of truth to that, and also not a shred of truth to this famous tale of Stern's. Now, as we all know, President Abraham Lincoln was attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington when he was shot around 10:15 p.m. on Good Friday, 1865, April 14th. He immediately lost consciousness. He was carried across the street to a boarding house where they said really it was a fatal wound from the start. Only Lincoln's tremendous, robust health allowed him to survive as many hours as he did overnight, but he did die early the next morning, of course, without ever regaining consciousness. But in the Stern legend, the president, in fact, did regain consciousness for a time, and he asked that Abner Doubleday be brought to his side, and that when Doubleday arrived at Peterson House, the president clutched his arm and implored him, "Doubleday, don't let baseball die." I know this is an impossible question, but Gabriel, what, if anything, can you say about a story like that?
I would say that Bill Stern was not half-assed in his efforts. He went the whole mile in inventing that one.
Yeah, I mean, you got to give the man credit for imagination.
Yeah, Stern was a guy who also got a lot of mileage out of things like Babe Ruth promising to hit home runs for boys in hospital beds. Mm-hmm. That was a Bill Stern kind of story.
Oh, very much so.
Probably happened here and there, but it was a staple for him.
Indeed. So let's fast forward to the 20th century, and I have to confess, before I did a little reading to refresh myself for this program, I did know that the first president of the United States to throw out a ceremonial first pitch on opening day was William Howard Taft, who did it in 1910. But somehow I had concocted a little bit of myth of my own in my mind. Now, I'll preface this again just so people know this is not true, and I know it's not true, but, it is factual.
In the spirit of Bill Stern.
Yeah, it is factual, though, that baseball in the early part of the 20th century was still seen as a bit of maybe a roughneck entertainment, not for classier people, not for women. And so somehow I had concocted the idea in my mind that Taft had been asked to throw out that first pitch to lend an aura of respectability to the game. Absolutely not true. I don't know what I was thinking. In fact, the reality is, and I just love so many aspects about this story, and I want to offer up the nutshell story and a comment or two, and then get your take as well. That, in fact, the first pitch ceremony in 1910 was not planned, that Taft was having a bad day on the job, and, it's kind of sad that, but just the fact of life, William Howard Taft didn't have many good days as president of the United States. He absolutely hated the job, and Warren Harding did very little good as president of the United States. But in 1921, when he made William Howard Taft Chief Justice, he did a very good thing, and Taft more than once said those last 9 years of his life were the happiest of his life. But that very morning, opening day, 1910, the president had met with a group of leaders of the women's suffrage movement. The meeting didn't go well, and so on a spur-of-the-moment decision, he decided to just go to the ballpark, take in the afternoon game, cheer himself up a little bit. Well, when the manager of the Senators, Jimmy McAleer, learned the president was in the house, he just got the bright idea. Let's ask him to throw out the first pitch, which Taft agreed to. And the original idea was for Walter Johnson, the Senators' great pitcher, to catch the ball. But among many other fine qualities, Walter Johnson was truly a modest, retiring kind of man. He begged off. So Gabby Street, the Senators' catcher, was all set to receive the ball. But at the last minute, Taft crossed everybody else. He turned and he flung the ball at Johnson, who luckily had the presence of mind to catch it. And so, an American tradition was born. But, excuse me, one of my first thoughts was, what a perfect reflection of how different the world was 109 years ago. For presidents, for professional Major League Baseball games, it's like every action, every moment is scripted. I have a friend who is a public address announcer for Portland's Major League Soccer team, and he once showed me they've got a script they follow down to the second. And so for the President of the United States just to wander in unannounced and somebody to say, "Hey, Mr. Prez, want to throw out the first ball?" Sure. I mean, well, your take on the unlikely birth of an American tradition.
There were a lot of traditions that originated casually. I mean, the seventh inning stretch is also sometimes attributed to the fact that Taft, a very large man, got uncomfortable in his seat at the ballpark and stretched around the seventh inning, and everybody imitated him.
Out of respect for the president, or maybe just saying, "Hey, this is a good idea."
Hey, exactly. Oh, the president did that. Yeah, that feels good. Let's just keep doing that.
Yeah. And even though he's not here today, let's just keep it up.
Exactly.
Okay. And so the tradition has continued through the decades, through presidents. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's continued. Let me jump ahead a half a century to another Washington pitcher and another president. I was at the working at the desk at the Hall of Fame library one day, and I had my back turned to the door. This was about 15 years ago, and somebody came in, and I heard a voice behind me introducing himself. He says, "My name's Marty Katina." And I turned around, Marty Katina. Now, Marty was not a really prominent player. Mm-hmm. He was a relief pitcher for a few seasons in the 60s, mainly with the Senators. But I knew him. The way that you always kind of remember everybody whose baseball card you had as a kid, you just remember the names, even if nothing else, like Chuck Asigian for me, Pete Wisenant, Marty Katina. So I was very happy to meet him, and he was very happy to meet somebody who knew his name, I think. Anyway, I now have a photo that Marty Katina sent me, which he signed, of the time that he shook John F. Kennedy's hand when the president threw out the first pitch in Washington, and it eluded the catcher, and there was a mad scramble by the Senators watching on for the ball, and Marty Katina won the scramble, went up to hand the ball back to the president, and there's a great photo of them shaking hands.
Wow. So, and did President Kennedy sign the ball for him? Did he get to keep the ball?
I don't think so.
Oh, darn. Darn.
Yeah, I don't think so.
But at least he's got the picture, and that is very
he had a lifetime memory. Yeah, that would have. I'm not sure which year it was. I could probably find out, but.
Yeah. Only
that's how the pitchers were thrilled just to be there. I might add. I'm looking at Marty Katina's record now. 1962 was his final season in the majors. Mm-hmm. He was a reliever. Pitched 54 games that season. So it would have been 61 or 62.
Well, excellent. And it's just something how, I cannot think of another major league sport that has received, anything close to this sort of a ceremonial blessing from the occupant of the highest office in the land. And, It's endured through Democrats and Republicans. It's endured. It endured the long absence of a major league franchise from Washington. It has evolved. I believe, if my reading is correct, that right up through the 1970s, the president always made the first toss from his box, and it was actually Ronald Reagan. Oh, here's another presidential connection, of course. Reagan, we know, in his pre-Hollywood days, was a radio announcer and did teletype recreations of Cubs games. So, it must have been quite a thrill for him half a century or more later to stride onto the mound at Wrigley Field and become the first president actually to throw the first pitch from the mound. Yeah.
Well, let me back up a second and just
sure.
Take a minute to explain what those recreations were. They were far more acting than announcing. And so Dutch Reagan, as I think he called himself then, was the perfect guy for it. You would have Reagan, in this case, sitting in a radio studio with a teletype machine that would bring the teletype results of the next batter, one batter at a time. All it would say was pop out, single, force play, whatever. And it was up to the guy in the studio to invent the whole broadcast, to invent the pitch-by-pitch progression of the game with sound effects for the sound of the bat hitting the ball, canned crowd noises, the whole bit. It was almost live theater based on the skimpiest facts from the actual game. It was an art form.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and I don't know how you feel about the film Bull Durham, but I actually I love it. Not only is it probably my favorite baseball movie, it's one of my favorite movies, period. But one of the things I love about that is you get a glimpse of the Durham announcer with the cartridge machine, recreating a road game with the cartridge machine, with the crowd noise, wrapping a wooden block to simulate the crack of the bat, and in this day and age when anybody with an internet connection can literally witness every pitch, every major league game, and probably that to imagine a world where that that was the practice is just. It seems so very, very far away, long ago and far away, which I guess it was.
Absolutely.
Now, fairly recently, we even had a president of the United States, the George Bush the Younger, who before his presidency, actually before he entered elective politics, became the governor of Texas, was a part owner of the Texas Rangers. And again, unless my memory has failed me, I'm having trouble thinking of any other president who actually had ownership interest in a major league team in any sport.
I think that's probably correct, although I can't help thinking that some politicians haven't wanted to get in on Dallas Cowboys by now.
Oh, yeah. Again, I'm thinking of presidents as baseball fans, and, it was well known that Richard Nixon was a pretty avid football fan. I think the year that Vince Lombardi coached the Redskins, he even sent Lombardi some suggested plays, but he was a very, very avid baseball fan, and something that I found fascinating just one day while kind of doing random wandering on YouTube, there is, I think it's about 1978, Nixon, living in retirement in California, dropped by the California Angels broadcast booth and had an extended visit with Dick Enberg. Nothing about
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Politics. Yeah, just all about his love of the game. And if I remember correctly, I mean, he, among the names that Nixon brought up that day was Archie Vaughan. And, you have to be a reasonably avid baseball fan to be able to recall Archie Vaughan these days.
Yeah, great shortstop, mainly Pirates in the 30s. There was another shortstop I wanted to mention in connection with Nixon. Sure. I think it was in 1969 or thereabouts, as part of the baseball centennial. Nixon named his all-time baseball team.
Right.
And in retrospect, Saber types have looked back at the list, and the one thing they really give him credit for is Ernie Banks as a shortstop. Oh. And a lot of people forget that Banks spent a little more than half his career as a first baseman, but his greatest seasons were as a shortstop. Sort of like Alex Rodriguez had his greatest seasons as a shortstop and did less as a third baseman. Just a matter of chance and history. True. But Nixon at one time was a candidate to become the head of the Players Union, the job that eventually went to Marvin Miller. But
right, and wasn't there talk I've come across also?
Politics. Excuse me?
Yeah, that maybe at about that same time, or perhaps slightly later, after Ford Frick stepped down after his second term as commissioner, and before they hired retired General Spike Eckert, who forever is infamously known in baseball history as, I'll give you the punchline,
the unknown soldier.
Yep.
Or the unknown general.
Yes, the unknown soldier. But that there was some, at least some talk of Nixon as a potential candidate. But, whether he just simply wasn't interested, or, that was after his failed bid for the presidency before his comeback, maybe thought that would be too much of a sidetracking. But,
maybe he thought baseball wouldn't kick him around again sufficiently.
Well, how about, another thing that I think reflects baseball's unique place in history, and, perhaps to an extent that really at the time of the two world wars of the 20th century, it was really the only really premier major league sport on a national level, even though it was confined to one quadrant of the country. But professional football, hockey, and basketball, either on much lesser scales. But for instance, when 1918, the infamous Work or Fight Act was issued, and I think it was every able-bodied man below the age of, now I'm going off the top of my head, but I think below the age of 35 either had to enlist active duty in the armed forces or go to work in a defense-related industry or an essential industry.
Exactly.
And baseball appealed for an exemption, which was not granted, and so that year the season was curtailed rather quickly. I believe, wasn't it around Labor Day?
Right around Labor Day. Yeah. They got a dispensation to do that much and to hold the World Series.
Right. Technically, without that, they conceivably could have been forced to shut it down immediately. And I'm thinking you likely know, Gabriel, and I know, but I don't. Even though by the time 1919 rolled around, the war was over, that the 1919 season was shortened as well.
They had agreed to do that before the world situation changed enough that they realized, we could have had a full season. They had pulled the trigger on the logistics and scheduling of all that, and they decided to just go ahead with it.
Then a generation later came World War II, and a war that had been building up for years. Active warfare in Europe, of course, commenced in September of 1939, but although the United States was getting itself on a war footing, it didn't actually enter the war until after the attack on Pearl Harbor. So I believe it was January of 1942. Judge Landis, the commissioner of baseball, sent a letter. Pardon me?
Yes, I can give you the background on that story.
Yeah, sent a letter to President Roosevelt, and please, I was going to ask you, talk about the background, what led up to that letter, and the response.
Well, of course, the Pearl Harbor attack happened in December in the off season, but the baseball was immediately worried about whether they get to play the season at all. Clearly, this was a much more urgent situation for the country than entering World War I late in that battle was. And they wanted to establish their footing as soon as they could. And, in World War I, they almost had to shut down because there was nothing special about them. So the trick was, or the complication was, that Judge Landis was a staunch conservative who hated Roosevelt and Roosevelt's liberal policies. I mean, he loathed the man. He wanted to have nothing to do with him. Now he was in the position of having to beg for the continuance of his sport and his job. And Clark Griffith interceded. Griffith was a longtime owner of the Washington Senators and a friend of Roosevelt and an ally of Landis. And I'm not sure whether Griffith composed the letter to Roosevelt or not, but he made the delivery of that letter possible. And the result was that FDR came through with what is famously called the green light letter, which told Landis, baseball must carry on. It's necessary for the morale of the nation. And it was, I know you want to say more about this. It was really the official presidential seal of what had been true for about a half century, which that baseball was and is the national pastime, and that therefore it was in the nation's interest for baseball to continue, albeit with half their players drafted, but still it continued through the war for that very reason.
If we could find a guest sometime, I think baseball in the Second World War would be a fascinating topic for a program in and of itself, but just focusing on the green light letter, I find it absolutely fascinating. And again, I wonder if this could have something to do with Clark Griffith's behind the scenes manipulation of things. I believe Landis's letter to Roosevelt is dated January 14th, and Roosevelt's response is literally dated the very next day. And again, even in wartime, or even in that era, you just didn't magically work your way to the very top of the president's attention, and especially, maybe 5-6 weeks after the United States had gone to war. So, I just find it a fascinating chapter where the presidency and the national game, kind of marched together to, And again, I think that kind of reflects on the brilliance of Roosevelt. Certainly there's a man to this day who is revered by many, loathed by others, but I just love a line. One of my favorite actors, Orson Welles, said, I believe it was, somewhere around 1939-40, he paid Roosevelt a visit in the Oval Office, and FDR says to Orson Welles, "You and I are the two best actors in America." And, this is veering off maybe a little bit, but I think as you look at the evolution of the presidency, FDR, seizing the tools of radio, the newsreel, the fireside chat, that he truly realized, and I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, but, even though it can be misused, that politics, the presidency, it's theater, that whatever your aims are, whatever your goals in public office, if you don't have the people behind you engaged with you, then there's very little, if anything, you can get done.
Absolutely. Well put.
Well, thank you, my friend. And, I think we are heading up on the half-hour mark, and so time to bring it home. But, anything related to this broad topic that, is just burning that you haven't had a chance to share?
No, that's all I know on the subject, Claire.
Yeah, well, now come on. I'm an amateur baseball historian, but you're the professional. You're the man who worked for the Hall of Fame, so you're the certified professional. So as much as I know, I'm always going to expect you to know at least a little bit more. Gabriel, thank you for a very fun half hour. Gabriel Schechter, my co-host on Claire's Corner, looking at really the unique intersection of baseball and the American presidency. I thank you for being with me, Gabriel. Look forward to our next
My
visit.
pleasure.
And thank you all for listening. And until we meet up again, happy trails.
The proceeding has been a comfortably zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices, and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.